All right, so today we're doing a deep dive on something I'm sure everyone's heard about, deep learning. And look, you all are smart people. You probably heard the hype, seen the headlines.
Definitely a lot of buzzwords floating around out there.
Exactly. So we're cutting through all that to figure out what really matters about deep learning, what's actually changing in the world because of it.
And what we need to be paying attention to, even if we aren't, coding these things ourselves.
100%. We're talking about AI that can take something like a blurry old family photo and make it crystal clear, like magic. Or listen to a child speak and spot developmental issues way earlier than we ever could before.
That's the power of deep learning. But it's easy to get lost in those wow moments without really understanding how it works.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is for. We were given this presentation on deep learning, and it's got a lot of really dense info. Our mission is to break it down.
And I think even if you're familiar with the basics, there are some pretty mind-bending implications in this presentation that are worth unpacking.
Absolutely. So for anyone who needs a refresher, what exactly are we talking about when we say deep learning?
So at its core, deep learning is a subset of machine learning, right?
Okay, so we're already getting into the weeds a bit.
Right, but it's important. Essentially, deep learning uses these things called artificial neural networks, basically computer systems that are inspired by the way our brains work. And it uses them to analyze and learn from data.
Okay, that makes sense. But where does the deep part come in? What makes it more than just your average machine learning?
It's all about how these neural networks are structured. Imagine layers stacked on top of each other, and each layer processes information, pulling out more and more complex features from the data.
Okay, so it's like each layer builds on the last, getting more sophisticated as it goes deeper.
Exactly. Think of it like this. We want to teach a computer to recognize, say, a cat in a picture. The first layer might just detect basic edges and lines.
Right, like the very basic building blocks of an image.
Exactly. Then the next layer takes those edges and starts combining them into shapes, like that circle could be the cat's eye.
And then another layer recognizes, okay, those shapes arranged like that, those are ears, a nose, whiskers, boom, cat.
You got it. And the deep part refers to having lots of these layers, sometimes dozens or even hundreds, all working together.
So that's how it can do such complex stuff.
Right. That depth allows deep learning models to pick up on incredibly detailed patterns, things we used to think only humans could do.
Like predicting those earthquakes or
Yeah,
bringing those old photos back to life.
exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting, because the presentation goes beyond just explaining what deep learning is. It digs into how these models are actually trained.
Okay, so instead of programming every little rule, we're letting these deep learning models learn by doing.
Exactly. Think about it like this. It's like learning a language by immersing yourself in it versus trying to memorize a bunch of grammar rules.
Yeah.
We feed these models huge amounts of data, and they just figure out the patterns and relationships on their own.
So it's less about telling the computer, this is a cat, and more about showing it a million pictures of cats.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the implications of that are huge because it means these models can learn things that we don't even know how to program, things that are hard to explain with our traditional algorithms.
Okay, now that is both really cool and a little intimidating.
It is, and that's exactly what we'll delve into after the break. Because while this presentation highlights some truly amazing applications of deep learning, it also brings up some really important questions about the potential downsides of this technology.
Welcome back. All right, so before the break, we were talking about how these deep learning models are trained, how they actually learn. And it's kind of wild, right? It's not like we're giving them a set of instructions.
Yeah, no, it's more like we're giving them a crash course. Or better yet, it's like they're teaching themselves.
Exactly. So let's talk about what they're doing with all that knowledge, because the source material you gave us dives into some seriously impressive applications for this tech.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just, theoretical stuff. They've pulled out examples that show how deep learning is already being used. The good and the, well, potentially not so good.
Let's start with the good stuff. What has you most excited when you think about the future of deep learning?
So one area where I think this technology has huge potential is healthcare. And actually, the presentation talks about this really cool study where they trained a deep learning model to analyze how kids talk.
I think I read about that. It can spot developmental delays way earlier than we used to be able to, right?
Yeah, like way earlier. We're talking months, sometimes even years before traditional methods, which obviously has a massive impact.
For sure. That early intervention can make all the difference. So we've got these life-changing medical applications. But that's not all. The presentation also talks about everything from restoring old, blurry photos to, get this, designing video games.
Right, like actually generating new levels and characters and stuff.
So is AI about to put game designers out of a job?
Well, the presentation actually uses this term sequence generation to describe how these models work. They can watch, like, hours of Super Mario gameplay and then
Create a whole new level that looks like it belongs in the game.
exactly. And what's crazy is it's not just copying. It's like these models are learning the rules of the game world and then using that knowledge to imagine something new.
That's both amazing and a little bit creepy, right? Like, where
Right.
does that creativity come from?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And the presentation talks about how this ability to analyze and then build on existing data, it's not just for entertainment, you know? This has huge implications for fields like finance and scientific research.
So, tons of potential,
Mm.
but it can't all be good news, right?
Hmm.
I mean, deep learning is powerful, and we've all heard those warnings about things like deepfakes.
Absolutely. And to their credit, the presentation doesn't shy away from those concerns at all.
Good, because that's something I really want to dig into.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about that.
Awesome. Everyone stick around. We'll be right back after a quick break.
And we are back.
All right, so we've been talking about some really cool applications for deep learning, but we have to talk about the potential downsides too. Because even with all the good, there's always a chance things could go wrong.
Yeah, and this presentation definitely acknowledges that. Actually, they spend a good amount of time talking about the potential downsides of deep learning.
Good. Because it's something we need to be aware of, right? I mean, we're talking about things like deepfakes. It's not just about figuring out what's real and what's fake anymore. It's about, I don't know, does it make us trust anything less?
Totally. And the presentation talks about that, how deepfakes basically force us to be way more critical of everything we see and hear,
We can't take anything at face value anymore. We have to question everything.
which is exhausting, right? But the source also pointed out that deep learning can actually be used to fight against misinformation too.
Exactly. They talked about how researchers are trying to build these deep learning algorithms that can spot those fake videos and images, even as the technology to create them gets better. It's like a never-ending race.
Yeah.
It really makes you think who's going to come out on top. But even beyond deep fakes, it feels like there are so many ethical questions here. Because we're talking about AI that can analyze data on a scale humans never could, and then make decisions based on it.
Absolutely. And this presentation really makes you think about things like bias in the data itself. If you have a deep learning model and it's being trained on biased data,
It's going to make biased decisions.
exactly. So it's not enough to just build these powerful AI systems, right? We have to think about the data we're giving them and be prepared for the consequences if those AIs make the wrong call.
We can't just hand over the reins. It's more important than ever to understand how this stuff works.
Totally agree. And I thought this was really interesting. The presentation mentioned that deep learning, it really thrives on what they call unstructured data.
Unstructured data. Okay, break that down for me.
So it's basically all the data that we create every single day that isn't, neatly organized in some spreadsheet. It's the stuff we post on social media, the pictures and videos we take, even our emails.
So all those little digital traces of ourselves, that's unstructured data.
Exactly. And the presentation, they said this data is like gold to these deep learning algorithms because it can show them patterns and things about how we behave that you just couldn't get from normal data.
So these AIs are learning about us from everything we do online, which I don't know about you, but that's a little unnerving, but also kind of fascinating.
It really is. Definitely leaves us with more questions than answers. But that's part of what makes exploring these new technologies so interesting, right?
For sure. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. It's amazing how much potential deep learning has, but there are some very real concerns there too. And it's clear that this tech is going to keep changing our world in ways we can't even imagine yet.
100%.
So to everyone listening, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed right now, that's understandable. The important thing is to stay curious, stay informed. Don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Great chat today. I always learn so much from our deep dives. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of deep learning. Until next time.